Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're setting aside pretty much everything we think we know about modern criminal justice.
Right.
Forget DNA, forget forensics, forget, a system mostly built around state punishment.
Totally different framework.
We are diving deep into the foundations of Athenian law, specifically how the ancient Greeks handled murder. Our mission is to try and get a real handle on why, for them, homicide wasn't just a crime against one person.
No, not at all.
It was seen as this crisis of supernatural pollution, a kind of contagion that put the whole city-state at risk.
And that concept, pollution, is the absolute anchor for everything we're talking about today. It's key. The Greeks called it miasma.
Miasma.
Yeah, a religious stain, a defilement. You have to picture a worldview where shedding human blood, especially, well, in certain situations, didn't just harm the victim's family. It actively polluted the ground itself. It angered the chthonic gods and the underworld deities and the spirits of the dead.
Wow, so actual physical pollution almost.
In a way, yes. A spiritual, physical contamination. And if the city, the polis, didn't manage to purge itself of this stain, this miasma,
Then what?
then the pollution could manifest as collective disaster. We're talking plague, famine, losing wars.
Okay, so the stakes were incredibly high. This wasn't just abstract belief.
Not at all. It meant that criminal law and, keeping the gods happy were completely tangled together, inextricably linked.
The sources we're drawing on for this are fascinating, aren't they? Because they really bridge that gap between myth and actual legal practice.
They do. We're leaning pretty heavily on the high drama of Aeschylus's Oresteia trilogy.
Right, the big one.
Which isn't just telling a story, it's basically creating a foundation myth for the very judicial shifts we're exploring, how Athens dealt with this stuff.
And we're backing that up with details on the actual legal nuts and bolts, the procedures they set up.
Exactly. The specific legal mechanisms the Athenians put in place to handle what they saw as essentially a recurring divine crisis.
So I guess the core question for us today, the thing we really need to unpack is this. How did the Athenians manage to move from that really archaic cycle of private blood feuds?
Yeah, the endless revenge cycle.
Driven by this terrifying idea of divine retribution where, the only answer to a killing was another killing. How did they get from that to a structured public legal system?
And a system designed not just to punish, but maybe more importantly, to heal the community, to cleanse that miasma.
It really is one of the most, profound shifts you can imagine in legal history, isn't it?
Absolutely fundamental.
Okay, let's try and unpack this historical shift. Starting where the conflict often began in the myths. The household. The oikos.
Right, the oikos.
Oh.
Because in that mythological background, before codified law really takes hold, homicide is almost always tangled up in families' violence. It creates what the sources sometimes call the household's curse.
And this isn't just like family arguments, it's deeper.
Oh, much deeper. It's an endless, self-perpetuating cycle of violence within the family unit, generation after generation.
The Oresteia is the classic example, right? It lays it all out.
It's the definitive literary exploration of this very cycle. It spans generations of curses and counter-curses. I mean, think about the family tree.
It's messy.
You've got Atreus and Thyestes. Then Agamemnon sacrifices his own daughter, Iphigenia.
Which leads to
Agamemnon then being murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover, Aegisthus. Each violent act just generates a new, seemingly equally valid demand for revenge.
So the house itself is just permanently stained, polluted.
Exactly. And what's really crucial here, host speaker, is that this revenge, it isn't really a choice. It's not just about feeling angry or wanting payback.
It's mandated.
It's seen as mandated by a specific divine principle. It's this idea of unavoidable consequence.
Is that where that phrase comes in? The paedenton erxanta?
Precisely. Paedenton erxanta. It roughly translates to that the doer suffers. And this principle is, frankly, terrifyingly deterministic,
Yes.
meaning it suggests a constant, inescapable pattern, a cycle of reversal and vengeance that just dictates events. If you shed blood, the moral and divine scales require that you or someone in your house suffer something equally bad.
So characters are just trapped.
They're perpetually trapped in this pattern. They're looking for some kind of stability, some end to it, but private revenge alone can never actually deliver that. It just keeps the cycle going.
Okay, so when Orestes, who's Agamemnon's son, comes back to avenge his father by killing his mother Clytemnestra,
Yes.
he's arguably doing what's expected, right? Following that paedenton or erxanta rule, avenging his father.
From one perspective, yes. The perspective of avenging his father's murder.
So why does that act, that necessary vengeance, immediately turn him into the target? Why did the Furies come after him and drive him mad?
Because in this ancient worldview, the intent sometimes matters less than the physical fact of the shed blood, especially when it's the blood of your own mother. Matricide.
So even if it's justice for his father,
Right. While avenging a father is justified under one set of rules, you could say the heroic code, killing your mother, violates an even older, maybe more fundamental law, the law of the hearth, the sacredness of the maternal bond.
so Orestes' act, even though it avenges Agamemnon, creates a whole new miasma, maybe even a worse one.
Arguably, yes, a deeper, more dangerous pollution because it strikes at the very root of kinship.
And the agents who enforce this consequence are the Furies, the Erinyes.
Correct. They are the terrifying, relentless agents of divine enforcement for these kinds of crimes. In the Orestia, they literally become the prosecuting attorneys, you could say.
Wow.
They're described specifically as the child-avenging fury. They represent these ancient, primal forces driven by the absolute need to punish those who break the sacred bonds of family blood.
So their pursuit of Orestes isn't just psychological torment.
No, it's the physical embodiment of the inescapable spiritual consequences of murder. It's miasma made visible, made terrifyingly real, a kind of spiritual disease literally chasing the polluted person.
But Orestes tries to fix it, right? He goes for ritual purification.
He does. He flees to Delphi, the sanctuary of Apollo. And Apollo, who actually encouraged the revenge, performs a purification ritual for him. Apollo says, the bloodshed was necessary for your father's honor.
Okay, so if a major Olympian god like Apollo does the cleaning ritual,
Yeah.
why aren't the Furies satisfied? Why does the pollution, the miasma, stick?
This is such a critical point, with huge theological and, importantly, political weight. Apollo's purification. It's enough to cleanse Orestes' individual soul, you might say.
So it helps Orestes personally.
It solves the spiritual problem for him. But, and this is the key, it cannot solve the public problem for the community. The miasma from matricide is just too severe, too damaging to the whole social fabric.
Ah, so it needs more than just a personal ritual.
Exactly. It demands a political and judicial resolution, something that goes beyond religious ritual alone. The problem has basically outgrown Orestes' private guilt and become about the city's collective security.
Which is why the Furies follow him to Athens.
Precisely. The problem can no longer be contained just by the gods, like Apollo, or by the individual Orestes. It requires a new kind of power to resolve it, the power of the organized city-state.
And this leads us right into that massive shift, doesn't it? The transition from the private household, the oikos, to the public city-state, the polis.
Yes. And Aeschylus, the playwright, he isn't just retelling an old myth here. He's consciously crafting a foundation myth for Athenian justice.
He's giving it a political purpose.
Exactly right. He's rewriting the traditional story to provide a specific, very powerful political justification for the Athenian legal system, particularly the Areopagus court.
So the answer to these terrible generations-spanning blood feuds isn't found in the oikos anymore.
No. He explicitly moves the resolution away from the chaotic, private world of the household, where revenge is the only response, and places it firmly within the legal and political framework of the city-state, the polis. The polis offers order.
And the whole climax of the trilogy depends on the Furies agreeing to this new setup, right? Accepting a role within the city.
Yes. The trial itself on the Areopagus Hill is almost just the prelude. The real resolution, the masterstroke, is Athene's political negotiation afterwards.
She doesn't just defeat them.
No, that's crucial. She doesn't defeat or banish them. She persuades them. She offers them not punishment, but institutionalized honor and perpetual worship within Athens.
She basically gives them the new job description.
That's a great way to put it. She rebrands them. She transforms these terrifying Erinyes, the Furies, into the Eumenides, the kindly ones.
Kindly ones, okay.
Now they become protectors of Athens, guardians of the city's welfare. They're responsible for ensuring good harvests, fertility, civic prosperity, but only if the city upholds its own laws.
Wow. So the city doesn't get rid of the divine demand for justice against bloodshed.
No, it domesticates it, it integrates it into the civic structure.
And the play ends with these big choruses praising the polis.
Exactly. Praising the city and its new, just order. It cements the idea that only the organized city-state is powerful enough, legitimate enough, to manage this dangerous divine pollution and finally break the endless cycle of the blood feud. It's a really stunning piece of political theology when you think about it. #22, the Athenian legal mechanism for homicide.
Okay, so the mythological solution then is the polis taking ownership of this miasma problem. Let's step out of the theater for a bit and look at the actual machinery Athens built to handle this. Who was actually in charge of homicide cases?
This is where the structural details really confirm that religious foundation we were just talking about.
Yeah.
Unlike almost every other kind of legal case, which eventually got handled by the big democratic courts, the dicasteria,
Right, the citizen juries.
the main jurisdiction for homicide, was given to the basileus, the king archon.
King Archon. That sounds a bit old-fashioned for democratic Athens.
It is. It's an ancient position, much older than the full democracy, and that's exactly the point.
Why him? Why the King Archon for blood crimes?
Because the basileus kept responsibility for most of the religious and sacred matters in the city, organizing big sacrifices, major festivals, that sort of thing.
Oh, okay.
Homicide was put under his control, specifically because it was understood, first and foremost, as a religious crisis. His job was fundamentally about managing pollution.
So his role signaled the religious nature of the crime.
Yes. By having the basileus preside over homicide cases, the state was clearly saying, these trials are primarily about fulfilling sacred duties to the community and the gods. It wasn't just about punishing a citizen. The basileus would oversee the initial purification steps needed even before a trial could properly begin.
And the actual trial itself, where did that happen?
That culminated in the court of Areopagus, the hill of Ares near the Acropolis.
The Areopagus. Even the name sounds serious. And that's the court from the Orestea, right? Orestes trial.
That's the one. Mythologically, it's the site of Orestes' trial, supposedly the first ever murder trial. Historically, it was a very venerable court.
Who sat on it?
It was made up of former archons men who had held the highest offices in the state. So it was a body of older statesmen, generally conservative, established, believed to hold deep respect for tradition and, crucially, divine law.
So not like the big, sometimes rowdy democratic juries.
Exactly. The Areopagus was seen as more stable, more solemn, the antithesis in many ways of the large juries of the dicasteria.
What exactly was its job regarding blood crimes? What fell under its remit?
It was responsible for judging the most serious cases: intentional homicide, wounding with intent to kill, arson, and poisoning. All crimes believed to inflict severe public miasma.
And its purpose wasn't just conviction or acquittal.
Well, yes, but more fundamentally, the court functioned to heal the rift in the city caused by the bloodshed. Its age, its prestige, gave its verdicts a necessary weight to satisfy both human legal demands and, crucially, the ancient demands represented by the Furies, now the Eumenides.
Even the location mattered, being on that hill.
Absolutely. The very physical space, a rocky, exposed hill under the open sky, added to the sense of sacred gravity. This wasn't happening tucked away in a building. It was a public, almost cosmic reckoning.
So the goal of the trial wasn't just justice as we might define it, finding guilt or innocence, but was also this public, sacred act of healing.
Cleansing, precisely.
Yeah.
It was designed to achieve this very careful balancing act. On one hand, it had to establish guilt or innocence based on evidence and Athenian law. That satisfied the political need for order.
Okay.
But simultaneously, the verdict itself, whether it led to execution, exile, or acquittal after purification, was seen as the final necessary step in the purification process. Executing the judgment literally removed the miasma.
And if they failed? If the city didn't prosecute properly or the verdict was seen as wrong?
Then the pollution lingered. The miasma remained. And that was seen as an open invitation for divine wrath, plague, crop failure, whatever disaster the gods chose. The pressure to get it right was immense.
I want to touch just briefly on the wider legal context. Athenian law had different kinds of lawsuits, right? Dicai and graphae. Private suits versus public ones?
Yes, broadly speaking. Dicai were typically private suits brought by the injured party or their family, often resolvable by compensation. Graphae were public prosecutions any citizen could theoretically bring for offenses against the community.
So where did Hamas fit? It feels like a private, someone's family member is dead, but you're saying it had these massive public consequences.
It really stood apart. Formally, it was classed as an adikema.
Adikema, meaning?
An impious act, a religious wrongdoing. That classification itself inherently tied the legal action directly to the spiritual consequences, the miasma.
So the family still brought the case?
Yes, the family of the deceased usually retained the right, or maybe the duty, to prosecute. That's clearly a holdover from the older blood feud traditions.
But the state had to be involved.
Absolutely. The state had an overriding religious obligation to ensure the case was dealt with publicly and ritually. It couldn't just be settled quietly between families with money, for instance.
Why not?
Because that wouldn't cleanse the community. That wouldn't remove the public miasma. The state, through the Basileus and the Areopagus, mandated the specific procedures precisely because the pollution demanded collective action and resolution.
Okay, this religious foundation, the focus on miasma, it introduces a huge challenge for any legal system, doesn't it? If the main goal is purification, getting rid of the stain, does the killer's intention actually matter? Or is it just the result, the fact that blood was shed?
That is maybe the most intellectually sophisticated aspect of Athenian homicide law. Intent mattered hugely.
Really? Even with the focus on pollution?
Yes, because the Greeks, especially the Athenians, developed a really quite refined legal vocabulary to distinguish between different types of fault. Attic law actually showed what scholars call comparative leniency when judging homicide or injury or damage if it was clear there was no intention to cause harm.
So they couldn't just say, okay, blood was shed, that person's polluted, end of story.
No. For the courts to deliver a judgment that was truly just, and therefore, in their view, truly cleansing, they had to rigorously distinguish between these different degrees of fault. It was essential.
Okay, so how do they categorize it? Let's break down that hierarchy. You mentioned adikama for the impious act.
Right. At the top, you have the fully intentional act, the adiekama. This is what the order Eskenes explicitly linked to the cause of the impious acts which punishment will necessarily follow.
So this is premeditated murder, or killing in anger with clear malice.
Exactly. Deliberate wrongdoing. The kind of act where the resulting religious pollution, the miasma, is considered certain, severe, and demands the harshest legal response, often execution or permanent exile. This signals a deep moral flaw in the person who did it.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about killings where there wasn't malice? Accidents, mistakes?
This is where the crucial distinctions come in, separating those who are morally blameworthy from those who were perhaps just tragically unlucky. We move down to two other key terms, hamartema and taika.
Hamartema and taika, what's the difference?
Hamartema basically covers an error, a mistake made by the person involved. It's an act of genuine human error, maybe a lapse in judgment. Think of maybe accidentally hitting someone with a spear during athletic practice.
So the person made a choice, took an action, but the deadly result wasn't intended.
Precisely. They did something, but the outcome was unintentional. Now, the pollution, the miasma, is still present because blood was shed. But it's often seen as, well, forgivable, or at least manageable under specific conditions.
And how is that different from taike?
Taikas literally means fortune, or chance, pure luck, or rather bad luck. This refers to a death resulting from uncontrollable chance or misfortune. It's not a mistake made by the agent.
Like what? Give me an example.
Like maybe a tile falling off a roof during a storm and killing someone below, or a horse bolting unexpectedly. Circumstances entirely outside the person's control. An unforeseen intervention of fate, essentially.
Okay, I see the distinction. One is an unintended consequence of your action, hamartema. The other is just sheer accident, taiki.
Exactly. And if the court decided the death was due to taika, the pollution was seen as minimal or maybe unavoidable cosmic static.
So the killer wasn't really held responsible.
Legally, often not. They might still require a simple ritual purification, probably overseen by the Basileus, just to be safe, because blood was still shed. But they could often be readmitted to the community fairly quickly. There was no real fault assigned.
That seems like an incredibly difficult philosophical judgment to ask a court, even the Areopagus, to make consistently. How did figuring out this distinction, adikema, hamartema, taika, affect the actual legal outcome and, crucially, the purification process?
It determined everything. If the court ruled, it was adikema, intentional wrongdoing. Punishment was severe execution or permanent exile, confiscation of property. The pollution was seen as deep and requiring radical removal.
And if it was hamartema, the mistake.
If it was hamartema, the agent still bore some responsibility. They made an error. The standard penalty here was often temporary exile, maybe for a year, maybe longer.
And that exile wasn't just punishment.
No, it was seen as a vital part of the purification. By physically removing the person who, even unintentionally, caused the pollution from the sacred ground of the polis, the city itself was being cleansed.
So exile was a cleansing mechanism.
Yes. After the set period, and usually only if the family of the deceased formally accepted the killer back and agreed the purification rites were sufficient, the person could return.
But if the court decided it was pure tika, sheer chance,
then the pollution wasn't seen as stemming from the agent's moral or intellectual failing. So they didn't need exile or severe punishment. They still had to undergo some ritual cleansing again. Blood was shed, the miasma existed, however faint, but they were acquitted of legal fault.
The system had to be precise then.
Incredibly precise. Because punishing someone harshly for something deemed taike would itself be seen as unjust. And injustice, in their worldview, could create its own kind of civic pollution, angering the gods in a different way.
Wow.
So the whole purpose of the trial, in many ways, was to correctly categorize the death at Ikema, hamartema, or taike, so that the basileus and the court could prescribe the exact, appropriate purification needed to restore both individual and communal order.
This legal focus on knowledge, on intention, on whether someone made a mistake or was just unlucky, it feels like it mirrors the kind of questions philosophers were asking in Athens at the time, too.
Absolutely. You see this echoed very strongly in figures like Socrates. He was constantly probing the nature of justice, of virtue, of human action.
Like in that dialogue you mentioned with Euthydemus.
Exactly. Socrates gets Euthydemus to agree to the idea that, roughly, those who know the lawful conventions about humans do the just things. The implication is that acting justly requires knowledge.
So ignorance or error plays a role.
Yes. This whole line of philosophical thinking reinforces the idea that the community, through its courts, had to judge not just the act itself, but the agent's knowledge, their intent, their overall state of mind. And hamartima, a mistake, was perhaps a failure of knowledge or judgment that needed correction, like exile and reflection. But adikema, intentional wrongdoing, was a willful moral failure requiring a more drastic response. #TAQ5. Connecting law, religion, and community.
So putting it all together, the Athenian homicide system wasn't just, a set of legal rules like we might think of it. It was fundamentally a religious institution.
Deeply, deeply ingrained as one.
Right.
Its primary function, arguably, was safeguarding the entire city from divine contagion, from miasma.
And this wasn't unique to Athens necessarily, this idea of laws coming from the gods.
No, that's a very ancient idea. The social laws of many ancient societies, especially those around really serious things like murder, were historically seen as the work of the gods. They were believed to be founded on the shared communal beliefs, the things that held the poles together.
And the fear was real.
Absolutely. The fear of divine wrath, the gods sending plague, famine, military defeat because the community was polluted, made state intervention not just an option, but an absolute necessity. The moment blood was shed unlawfully, the whole community faced a tangible threat.
Which is why every homicide became a public affair. It couldn't just be ignored or settled privately.
Precisely. It demanded immediate legal and religious attention from state authorities.
Okay, but we also know that the Athenian courtroom, especially in the democratic era, could be intensely political. People used trials to score points, attack rivals.
Well, absolutely. It was an agonistic society, very competitive.
So how did the judges, even the solemn ones on the Areopagus, balance that vital religious need for purification with all the social and political maneuvering going on? Weren't those things in conflict?
That's a great question. The Athenian judges, and probably the jurors too, were keenly aware that getting a just result, one that would actually stick and be accepted, meant they had to consider the interplay of all these forces. They couldn't just isolate the judicial decision from politics or social standing.
So litigation wasn't just about the facts of the case.
Rarely just about the facts. It was deeply woven into social life. Trials were used to define status, to contest hierarchies, to shore up allegiances or destroy enemies. Litigants became experts at framing their case and painting their opponents as being dangerous to the city's overall well-being.
So even while they're trying to figure out the miasma and satisfy the demands of the Eumenides, the jury is also thinking about the social fallout, the political cost.
You have to assume so. Removing the miasma was non-negotiable. It was essential. But how you removed it, execution, exile, acquittal after purification, that decision carried huge political weight.
So the speeches in court weren't just about guilt or innocence.
Often they were about demonstrating that the prosecutor's case aligned perfectly with the interest of the demos, the people, and the overall purity and safety of the polis. You'd see accusations of the defendant's past impiety, or maybe their bad character, or previous shady dealings.
Things not directly related to the homicide?
Exactly. Things brought up to suggest that this person was already sort of polluted, already a risk to the community, and therefore convicting them and imposing the harshest sentence would be the best way to ensure a really thorough cleanse.
So the religious duty was still central, but it could be, let's say, strategically employed.
It was certainly manipulated for social and political gain. You could argue it was both a deeply held religious conviction and a powerful rhetorical tool.
That makes the whole process sound less like a pure spiritual ritual and maybe more like a kind of political performance aimed at achieving a necessary spiritual outcome.
I think it was absolutely both. For the system to work, the community had to believe that the purification achieved through the trial was legitimate. In an Athenian democracy, legitimacy was always tied up with satisfying the complex social and political forces at play.
While still ticking the boxes for the ancient religious requirements.
Precisely. Still appeasing the established demands of the gods, represented by the Eumenides. That inherent tension between the ancient, seemingly fixed religious duty and the fluid, messy political realities of democratic Athens is actually what made the system so interesting and maybe so resilient for a time. It managed to embed this ancient ritual necessity within a functioning, evolving legal framework.
We focused almost entirely on this very specific Athenian system, rooted in miasma. But the sources you mentioned earlier also hinted at a wider spiritual landscape in the Greek world. Were other ideas starting to challenge this intense focus on blood pollution?
Yes, the spiritual and intellectual climate wasn't static at all. While the fear of miasma seems to have remained pretty foundational in the legal sphere, especially concerning homicide, other ideas were definitely circulating and evolving.
Like what?
Well, you have philosophical religious movements like Pythagoreanism gaining influence, their belief in metempsychosis.
The transmigration of souls, reincarnation, basically.
Right. The idea that the soul passes through different bodies, maybe even including animals. This kind of belief often fostered a much stricter approach to life itself, sometimes leading to vegetarianism, for example, and just a general heightened aversion to shedding any blood, not just human blood in specific contexts.
So that would naturally reinforce the idea that life is sacred and blood pollution is dangerous.
It could certainly reinforce it, perhaps giving it new philosophical underpinnings beyond just the fear of the Furies.
And you also mentioned the Greeks encountering other cultures' gods.
Exactly. We see this particularly in writers like Herodotus, who traveled widely. He makes these interesting comparisons, equating Greek gods like Demeter, the grain goddess, and Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, with the major Egyptian deities Isis and Osiris.
And Isis and Osiris were heavily connected with death and rebirth, weren't they?
Very much so. They govern cycles of life, death, and resurrection. Bringing those kinds of narratives and theologies into the Greek consciousness potentially introduced alternative ways of thinking about the afterlife, about divine justice, about what happens after death.
Did these new ideas actually change the homicide laws, though? Did they dilute the fear of miasma?
Not directly, not in terms of dismantling the core legal framework built around miasma and the procedures of the Basilius and the Areopagus. That seemed quite entrenched. But these evolving beliefs illustrate that the public's understanding of the divine, of life and death, was fluid.
So even as philosophers were maybe exploring new spiritual paths and travelers were bringing back stories of different gods,
The foundational, almost gut-level fear of unpurged blood pollution, the miasma from homicide, seems to have remained the non-negotiable driver of the state's legal and ritual response. It was just too dangerous to ignore. #outro. So, if we try to synthesize this whole deep dive, the remarkable journey we've taken, I think we can say that for the Athenians, the homicide trial served this crucial, integrated, dual purpose.
Okay. What were those two sides again?
Well, first, it absolutely was a court of law. It was designed to determine legal guilt or innocence based on a surprisingly sophisticated assessment of fault and intention. You know, that crucial difference between adikema, hamartia, and taike.
Right. The intent mattered.
Yes. But second, and maybe as you said earlier, more urgently from their perspective, it was the state's most vital civic mechanism for performing an act of sacred healing.
The ritual cleansing.
The ritual cleansing required to remove that dangerous divine stain, the miasma, from the entire community. The city simply couldn't function politically, economically, even spiritually unless it felt it was properly purified from the pollution of shed blood.
It really does provide such clarity on why the outcome of a single trial could feel so existential for them.
Exactly.
The verdict wasn't just about what happened to the accused person. It was potentially about the fate of next year's grain harvest or the health of the city's children or success in the next battle. It makes you realize just how completely intertwined the spiritual and the legal really were for them.
Absolutely. It forces us to appreciate that justice, at least in that Athenian context, was fundamentally defined by its ability to restore both cosmic and civic order. It had to satisfy both gods and men, you could say.
So here's a final thought to leave our listeners with. If that ancient Athenian justice system kind of worked, or at least endured, because its public legal framework managed to satisfy both human legal needs and those perceived divine demands, thereby healing, or attempting to heal, the psychological and spiritual rift caused by violence, What does that tell us about modern legal systems?
That's a provocative question.
We have our formalized rules, we have punishments, judgments, appeals, but we no longer really have a shared, universally accepted, sacred language of ritual cleansing, do we?
No, generally not. We grapple with the psychological wounds, the social trauma that follows horrific violence, the collective impact, but mostly without that institutionalized ability to perform a literal, state-sanctioned, universally believed-in act of purification.
So, is there maybe perhaps a kind of persistent, unspoken form of collective miasma, maybe a metaphorical one, that we still feel today when justice seems to fail?
You mean when a court verdict, even if it's legally correct by the book, just doesn't feel right to the community, doesn't feel like closure?
Exactly. When it doesn't feel like a true societal cleansing and that sort of stain of failure or doubt or impurity lingers, maybe poisoning public faith in the whole system, that feeling that the crisis, the wound caused by the crime hasn't actually been resolved, that's certainly something worth mulling over.